Priscilla's Imitation is a channel that addresses errors of doctrine and practice in the church and culture. I'm Catherine Cardiff, a Christian seminary graduate, playing the role of Priscilla in Acts 18:26 to explain to you the way of God more adequately. Today's episode is the second in a series about the identity of Jesus. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, go ahead and do that first. The link for part 1 is in the description below. This series is based on an interview of agnostic atheist Dylan Cardiff, who had a three-pronged view of the identity of Jesus. In the interview, Dylan expressed some doubt about the existence of Jesus.
I can't say for certain that Jesus ever existed at all.
At the same time, Dylan also stated,
Personally, I don't think mythicism is very likely.
In part 1, I refuted the idea that Jesus is a myth. The information in today's episode actually fits in with part 1, since we will be discussing yet another piece of evidence that pertains to the historical existence of Jesus. Specifically, we'll be investigating Josephus' Testimonium Flavianum, which is such a complex topic that it deserved its own separate episode. But I will say up front that part 1 already established Jesus' existence in history. So unless this testimonium particularly interests you, please feel free to jump straight to part 3. Also, please pay attention to the screen to see when I'm directly quoting others. With all that being said, let's jump right in. Flavius Josephus makes reference to Jesus in 2 places in his Antiquities. In part 1, we already discussed the shorter reference, but the lengthier reference is a paragraph that later came to be known as the Testimonium Flavianum, which I will call TF. The TF was written in approximately AD 93 to 94, and Dr. T.C. Schmidt views it as an extremely important non-Christian text about Jesus. However, the TF is also highly debated. Schmidt notes that the earliest Greek manuscript of Antiquities 18 comes from the 11th century, and the TF is part of Antiquities 18. So the Greek version of the TF available to modern scholars is from around 9 centuries after Josephus penned the Antiquities. However, the TF was quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea much earlier than the 11th century, in about 313 CE. One important question to ask is, can we trust the Greek version of the TF? Dr. Mark Strauss states that most scholars consider the passage to be authentic, but to have been edited by later Christians. If that is the case, we would have a mixture of authenticity and inauthenticity combined together. But before we get into the possibility of textual editing, let's ask another important question. What is the content of the Greek version of the TF as we know it today? Here it is from one English translation. And in this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of miraculous deeds, a teacher of men who received truth with pleasure. And he led many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, those who at first loved him did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them alive again on the 3rd day, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up till now, the tribe of the Christians, who were named from him, has not disappeared. You can probably tell just by listening to this text why it would be valuable evidence about Jesus if it is indeed authentic. But Schmidt explains that 7 aspects of the TF have sounded overly aligned with Christianity, according to scholarly opinion, which has raised the question of whether Josephus the Jew would truly be the author of the entire passage. For example, why would a Jew who lacked faith that Jesus was the Christ write a sentence stating that Jesus was the Christ? It's definitely a valid question. You can probably already see why the TF can be such a breeding ground for scholarly debate. Alright, let's look at some scholars' views regarding this confusing puzzle. Shlomo Pines highlighted an Arabic version of the TF, which came from the pen of a 10th century bishop named Agapius. I've displayed it on the screen, but I'm not going to take the time to read it aloud. It's been observed that the TF is notably different in this Arabic version. Furthermore, a scholar explains that Pines believed the Christian elements seemed toned down in this Arabic version, which led him to conclude it was a more authentic version. However, another scholar points out that Pines has been refuted by Wheely, given that Agapius' passage is merely a loose paraphrase. Similarly, Schmidt states that Agapius is totally unreliable, given the liberties Agapius took in his summaries and quotations of others. So the Arabic version looked promising, but it turns out it cannot be trusted for accuracy. Agapius' Arabic version is not the version of the TF that we should focus on, since we want to have a more accurate idea of what Josephus actually wrote. Let's go back to the Greek version of the TF. Does the entire TF have the mark of a different author, or is it consistent with Josephus' style? Fernando Bermejo-Rubio rejects the views that the TF is 100% authentic or 100% inauthentic. His own view is that more than one author was involved in the extant text of the TF, but he still admits that most of the vocabulary and style is typical of Josephus. Similarly, Dr. Gary Habermas believes the TF is genuine overall, but contains some additions or changes, and Habermas comments that leading Josephus scholars have testified that this first portion is written in the style of this Jewish historian. His comment refers to the TF and Josephus. Bermejo-Rubio and Habermas both present this writing style information as evidence against the idea that the TF is 100% inauthentic. So, one of the reasons we should not dismiss the whole TF as fake is that it contains Josephus' writing style, at least to some extent. Schmidt also performed a stylostatistic analysis, which revealed that both common and rare words are present in the TF at the same frequency one would expect if Josephus were the author. So, evidence has been found that the contents of the TF would be consistent with Josephus' habits of writing. This is evidence against the idea that the TF is a forgery from start to finish. But even if we need to accept that at least some of the TF is genuine, how would we know which parts are genuine? Dr. John Meyer proposed that 3 portions of the Greek TF should be removed in order to reduce the text so that it only consists of the parts that Josephus authentically wrote. Meyer saw the marks of a Christian author in the following 3 clauses. Number 1, if indeed one should call him a man. Number 2, he was the Messiah. And number 3, for he appeared to them on the 3rd day, living again, just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. From Meyer's perspective, the TF reads smoothly after deleting the 3 sections that seem Christian, and the text that remains is indeed Josephan. Meyer's view is important to address, given that Dr. Paul Barnett wrote that those same 3 parts of the TF are almost universally agreed to be elements that were added to the text, although Barnett himself had a nuanced view of one of those elements. It turns out that Joseph Klausner selected the same 3 parts of the TF that Meyer selected, and Habermas states that Klausner's view is aligned with many other researchers. This demonstrates the frequent acceptance of this particular view and shows why it's worthwhile for me to take the time to discuss it. So let's take a close look at Meyer's 3 objections to the Greek TF. First of all, regarding the phrase, if indeed one ought to call him a man, Schmidt offers a variety of possible explanations and thoughts, and I will only share some of them here. Schmidt notes that Christian writers in the early centuries of Christianity would consider it heresy to reject the idea that Jesus was human. So Schmidt indicates that it wouldn't make sense for a Christian interpolator to insert a heretical concept. Schmidt also mentions the possibility that Josephus was sarcastic here. But Schmidt offers a different possibility that he thinks is quite likely. Josephus could have seen Pharaoh's magicians and Jesus in a similar light, with each relying on magic rather than divine power. If this is true, then Josephus would have perceived Jesus in a negative but powerful way, like a magician. The sequence of ideas in the TF text sheds light on this as well. The phrase, if indeed one ought to call him a man, is immediately followed by the explanation, for he was a doer of miraculous deeds. So it is as if the miracles are the reason that Jesus would not be categorized as a man. Also, the word underlying miraculous can be translated less favorably as incredible or even magical, according to Schmidt. Schmidt includes the word magical as part of his negative translation. If magical deeds is correct, then Josephus may have seen Jesus as a magician, and it would make sense that he would have trouble calling Jesus simply a man, but this would not have had a positive connotation. Overall, Schmidt's conclusion is that 1. Josephus wrote this phrase to show a lack of clarity about his own stance on Jesus, or 2. Josephus wrote this phrase because he was showing awareness of the divided opinions of his readers regarding Jesus. So Josephus could have spoken of Jesus in a sarcastic, magical, or ambiguous way, and all of these perspectives would have fit in with the fact that he was not a Christ follower. And as Schmidt notes, Josephus may have been thinking more of his readers' opinions than his own. Furthermore, the theology of the phrase is not the most consistent with standard Christian beliefs about Jesus' humanity. So why would a Christian have added that in? Since there is enough reason to leave this phrase as it is, let's accept it rather than moving into conjecture. We'll come back to the Messiah statement later. Now let's look at the third portion of the TF that Meyer thought should be deleted. Regarding the phrase, "for he appeared to them alive," Schmidt asserts that the Greek word phino has two meanings, actual appearing or seeming appearance. So there are two options to choose from. Schmidt explains that the TF uses phino with the participle alive, zone. And similarly, when Josephus wrote about things seeming to be the case elsewhere in his writings, Josephus favored writing phino with a participle. So as Schmidt indicates, Josephus could reasonably have written the phrase, "for he appeared to them alive," without intending to affirm Jesus' resurrection, because it could simply mean Jesus seemed to be resurrected from the perspective of the disciples. Also, if we consider the Christian interpolation view that Myers held, Schmidt helpfully points out that phino would be an improbable word choice for a Christian to use when reporting about post-resurrection encounters with Jesus, because the word harao is used for that topic in Matthew, Luke, Acts, and 1 Corinthians, and phino is not used there. Schmidt acknowledges that phino is indeed employed in 3 places in the long ending of Mark's Gospel, but he is quick to point out that each of the 3 cases are written so as to express a real appearance of Jesus due to the lack of a subordinate participle. Now, have your eyes glazed over yet? Bear with me. I know we really get into the weeds in this episode. Hang in there. Overall, the controversial statement, "for he appeared to them alive," may superficially look like the acceptance of an exclusively Christian claim that Jesus did indeed come back to life. But in reality, it can be explained in terms of Josephus writing about what others perceive to be true, and it cannot be readily explained in terms of Christian authorship. Regarding the statement, "given that the divine prophets spoke these and 10,000 other wonders concerning him," Schmidt draws on Lois Fuller's grammatical data to show that there are a range of meanings that this statement could take on. It could indeed mean that Jesus fulfilled prophecies, but it could mean, from the disciples' vantage point, Jesus fulfilled prophecies. Schmidt points out the ambiguity of the sentence structure and argues that we need not consider it a clear statement about Josephus' own perspective. If that is the case, we do not have a valid reason to delete this part of the TF as Meyer had proposed. Now, I've displayed Meyer's reduced version of the TF on the screen. It's important to note that even if Meyer's proposal is accepted, the parts of the TF that he deemed to be authentically Josephine are still valuable evidence for the historical Jesus. Habermas and Dr. Bart Ehrman have both essentially listed historical data that can be extracted from the TF when it lacks these 3 statements. Similarly, from the shortened text itself, we can see that even with these 3 statements removed, the TF would still demonstrate that A, Jesus truly existed in history. B, Jesus was a wise teacher. C, Jesus' actions were astonishing. D, Jesus was a leader. E, Jesus was crucified at Pilate's direction, which corroborates the Gospels. And F, Jesus' crucifixion did not squelch the Christian following. So, even Meyer's version of the TF provides enough information to affirm Jesus' historical existence, certain aspects of his life, his crucifixion, and his ties to Pilate and to Christianity. However, is it truly valid to remove parts of the Greek TF without textual evidence for it? When discussing textual criticism, Dr. David Black accepts conjectural emendation as unavoidable when it comes to the Old Testament. So apparently this is an acceptable scholarly practice in the right context. I'm definitely not a textual criticism expert myself, but conjectural emendation is not my preference, as it does not seem grounded in hard evidence. Drawing on others, Dr. Alice Wheely makes the important implication that textual evidence is a firmer foundation for analyzing the TF compared to assumptions about Josephus' perspective on Jesus. This is a crucial point. We can dice and splice the TF in any which way, as Pines has seen people do when scholars reshape the text according to their subjective opinions. Without reasonable textual evidence, each of us can make our own assumptions about what Josephus thought and create a TF that may have no grounding in actual history. Wheely notes the importance of investigating document sources. So we need to look at the historical documents that exist and the sources they came from. Let's look at the Syriac version of the TF. Schmidt quotes the TF as recorded by Michael the Syrian. In these times there was a certain wise man whose name was Jesus, if it is lawful for us to call him a man. For he was a doer of glorious works and a teacher of the truth. And he made disciples of many from the Jews and from the peoples. It was thought that he was the Christ. And it was through the testimony of the leaders of the people, on account of this, that Pilate gave him over to the punishment of the cross, and he died. But those who loved him did not cease from his love, as he appeared to them after 3 days alive. For the prophets of God spoke such astonishing things concerning him, and until today the people of the Christians have not disappeared and have been named from him. Wheely is right to observe that Michael's version of the TF and the Greek version are rather similar to each other, and we can see this for ourselves. Schmidt evaluates the probable sources of Michael the Great's Syriac version of the TF, which was penned at the end of the 12th century. I won't go into detail here, but Schmidt has reason to believe it's likely that Michael's TF comes from Jacob of Edessa's Syriac translation, which likely came from Jacob's dual use of the Syriac version of a work by Eusebius and first-hand consultation of a Greek document from Josephus, most probably the Antiquities. So, would Jacob of Edessa and Michael the Syrian be trustworthy sources? Schmidt reveals that Jacob of Edessa was careful to differentiate between primary source quotations and second-hand quotations. And Jacob was not in the habit of passing on previous Syriac translations without first verifying them with the original Greek and revising them as needed. At the very least, this shows Jacob's attention to detail and his effort to pass on information accurately. At the same time, Wheely showed some flaws in Michael's version. For example, she showed at least 3 errors, all of which have been caused by Michael's source or a copyist, though 2 of them could have come from Michael himself. But on the positive side, Wheely portrays Michael as conveying his source information in a literal way, in contrast to Agapius's loose paraphrase. Similarly, Schmidt finds an instance outside of the TF where Michael incorrectly quotes someone. But Schmidt also finds at least a little evidence of Michael properly handling other sources. Schmidt has greater confidence in Michael's reliability than Agapius's, and he even thinks there is some level of possibility that Michael has preserved his source's version of the TF at least somewhat accurately. So evidently there are pluses and minuses to Michael's citational record, but at least Michael surpasses Agapius in this area, and Michael can be relied upon to some degree. As for Jacob of Edessa, Schmidt's account of Jacob makes him sound rather reliable. Wheely indicates that one of the flaws in Michael's version is that it plainly mentions Jesus' death, not just Jesus' crucifixion. And this death reference is not verified by an early version in Greek or Latin, so this part can be dismissed as inauthentic. However, Michael's Syriac version does come in handy when it comes to the mystery of the statement about Christ. If you listened closely, you may have noticed that Michael's Syriac version did not simply say he was the Christ. It said it was thought that he was the Christ. So it's finally time to address the last clause that Meyer proposed as a rightful deletion from the TF, the statement, he was the Messiah. Schmidt explains that ancient readers of the TF appear to have read Christ as a name, rather than seeing this statement as a declaration of Jesus' religious status. If that is all Josephus meant by it, then there would be nothing inherently Christian about the statement, and no reason to speculate that the statement had been added later. Even so, Schmidt's own perspective is that the extant Greek manuscripts of the TF are lacking 2 to 3 words that would have appeared in Josephus' original work. Schmidt does not make this hypothesis out of thin air, but he looks to other manuscript evidence. Of the 2 changes Schmidt suggests here, the most significant is the qualification of the statement, he was the Christ, with the adoption of Michael's Syriac version, thought to be, and Jerome's Latin version, believed to be. Although Jerome had sloppy writing habits, Schmidt contends that Jerome's Latin version is corroborated by Michael's Syriac version regarding this specific phrase. On top of that, Wheely builds on Pines to show the unlikelihood that Michael saw Jerome's version, since that period of history did not allow for cross-pollination between Latin and Syriac writings, though they could have both seen the same Greek source. And it is more likely for the Greek source to have already contained the phrase than for similar changes to be made independently. All that being said, the take-home message is that Schmidt believes Josephus' original TF would have included something like he was thought to be the Christ rather than he was the Christ. And this is a reasonable hypothesis. Any non-Christian could easily make the statement he was thought to be the Christ, and there is at least some amount of manuscript evidence for this hypothesis, not mere conjecture. Furthermore, Barnett reveals the problems with fully deleting the sentence about Christ. For one, this is the only reference to the term Christ in the entire TF, but at the end of the TF there is mention of the tribe of Christians named after him. So, if the original TF did not contain the sentence he was the Christ, then the text would imply that the name Jesus is the source of the name Christians, which would be confusing for readers. Barnett makes a good point here. It is easy to see the connection between Christ and Christians, but there is no connection between Jesus and Christians in terms of shared names. Another issue Barnett raises is that removal of any messianic claim would mean there would be no valid reason for the Romans to crucify Jesus. So evidently it would be problematic to accept Meyer's proposal that the sentence about the Messiah was added later. Without that sentence, there would be a lack of coherence for the reference to Jesus' crucifixion and the reference to the name Christians. Barnett's solution is to add the word so-called to the sentence, given that elsewhere Josephus used the phrase the so-called Christ when writing about Jesus, as we saw in part 1. Barnett's conclusion turns out to be very similar to Schmidt's conclusion, even though they arrived at it from different angles. Schmidt and Barnett both believe Josephus' original TF contained a qualification of the statement about Jesus being the Christ, such as thought to be the Christ or so-called Christ. Of these, Schmidt's argument is more convincing since he actually had some manuscript evidence for it. But Barnett's logic was helpful as well, since he sufficiently refuted the idea that the whole messianic sentence had been added to Josephus' text later. To summarize this discussion about the statement he was the Christ, 1, it's possible that Josephus originally wrote he was the Christ and merely meant Christ as a name. 2, the sentence may have originally contained a qualification, such as thought to be, and there is Syriac and Latin manuscript evidence to support this hypothesis. 3, some version of this sentence must have been present in Josephus' original TF if the references to the crucifixion and to Christians were also original. As we wrap up our discussion about the Testimonium Flavianum, we'll briefly examine the forgery idea once more. Let's look at what Wheely has to say on this topic. Much of the past impetus for labeling the Textus Receptus Testimonium a forgery has been based on earlier scholars' anachronistic assumptions that, as a Jew, Josephus could not have written anything favorable about Jesus. Contemporary scholars of primitive Christianity are less inclined than past scholars to assume that most first-century Jews necessarily held hostile opinions of Jesus, and they are more aware that the line between Christians and non-Christian Jews in Josephus' day was not as firm as it would later become. It's important to note that former assumptions about Josephus' perspective may well have been incorrect. And without these anachronistic assumptions in place, the forgery hypothesis weakens substantially. Scholars need to be careful to avoid imposing modern or irrelevant worldviews upon the worldviews of first-century Jews. In our modern minds, there is a clear distinction between Christian views and Jewish views regarding Jesus. And Wheely isn't saying there was no distinction back in the first century, but we do need to leave room for more of a blurred line between Jews and Christians in that time period in terms of what they might have said about Jesus, because that was a completely different time period from our own. Overall, we could end up jumping to the conclusion that the TF has been forged if we approach the TF with the wrong assumptions, and then we would be rejecting important historical evidence for Jesus. For those of you who are familiar with the hypothesis that Eusebius forged the TF, I refer you to Appendix 1 of Schmidt's book, Josephus and Jesus, which provides a detailed refutation of this hypothesis, as Schmidt addresses the subject of writing style, reveals Eusebius' standard of integrity, and demonstrates that overall Eusebius handled quotations reliably. For those of you who are resolved to categorize all of the TF as inauthentic, I will reiterate that Jesus' historical existence was already established in part 1 of this series, even apart from the evidence found in the TF. Finally, Habermas brings up an important point that flies against the 100% forgery notion of the TF. He states that the second reference to James being the brother of the so-called Christ, according to most scholars, seems to demand an earlier comment that introduces Jesus to the readers. If you'll recall from part 1, Josephus' other reference to Jesus is accepted and is not under dispute the way the TF is. So it's significant that this genuine Josephine reference to Jesus assumes an earlier reference to Jesus. The TF would supply this earlier reference. Therefore, it's quite unlikely that the whole TF should be deleted as if it were entirely fabricated by someone other than Josephus. So to summarize this episode, 1, the Arabic version cannot be trusted for accuracy. 2, the presence of Josephus' vocabulary and style does not support the 100% forgery idea. 3, Meyer's 3 deletions are not necessary for the TF to be plausibly authored by a non-Christian like Josephus. 4, even if we applied Meyer's 3 deletions, the TF would still present a good deal of helpful information about the historical Jesus. 5, in terms of the sentence about Christ, Meyer's deletion of the entire sentence would cause problems for the coherence of the rest of the passage. Also, there is textual evidence from the Syriac and Latin versions that support a qualification of the sentence about the Christ. 6, earlier scholarship suffered from anachronistic assumptions about Josephus' perspective. 7, one reason we should reject the idea that the TF is 100% forgery is the fact that Josephus' second reference to Jesus is authentic, and it begs for previous context. In terms of my overall stance on the TF, for now, it's reasonable to be basically aligned with Schmidt's thesis that the TF found in extant manuscripts of the Antiquities is essentially authentic, and that it has merely lost 2 or 3 words that can still be found preserved in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Arabic, and Armenian textual witnesses. One of the 2 additions Schmidt proposes is the addition of the phrase "thought to be," which would qualify the statement about Christ. It's quite possible that this hypothesis is correct. As a side note, Schmidt would also add "tis" and subtract "eti," but that is not our focus here. So how certain can we be about this conclusion? Bermejo-Rubio noted about his own conclusion about the TF that certainty is not possible and every reconstruction remains hypothetical. And likewise, I would also say about my own conclusion that certainty is not possible, so my conclusion should be held somewhat tentatively. Also, as we all know, each of us have our own preferences based on our own worldviews, which impacts how we view the TF as well. Now, I gather that this YouTube episode has only revealed the tip of the iceberg regarding research and discussions on this topic. So, for those of you who are interested in this topic, I invite you to delve into your own research on the TF. Now, in presenting my general alignment with Schmidt's thesis, I want listeners to understand that this is a minority view, not the majority view. In 2024, Habermas provided helpful information about the scholarly opinions surrounding Josephus' TF. Number one, a minority of scholars embrace a totally authentic position, which used to be the traditional view. Also, Habermas places the mostly full authenticity perspective into this same category. Number two, there's a minority of scholars who tend to reject all of the TF. Number three, for a majority of scholars, most of the TF is authentic, but the parts deemed to be Christian are not authentic. This majority perspective is not uniform, but contains some diversity. Habermas also shows that for some scholars, the Arabic version is potentially original or resembles the original more. Now, we've already discussed the problem with the Arabic version and some issues with the 100% forgery view. At this point, some of you may not be quite convinced that we should embrace a minority view of the TF that leans toward complete authenticity. If that is the case, I want to conclude by returning to the majority scholarly opinion and seeing the importance of Josephus' Testimonium Flavianum in light of the majority view. In 2024, Habermas wrote that, in spite of some question marks here and there regarding the exact wording of the longer comment in Antiquities 18.3, by far the majority of contemporary historians view the bulk of his statements as providing probable and valuable attestation of some of the foremost items in Jesus' public ministry. So, if you accept the majority view about the Testimonium Flavianum, then you would also need to accept that it provides probable evidence about Jesus' ministry. And of course, if Jesus had a ministry here on earth, he must have actually existed in history. Thank you for accepting Priscilla's invitation to part 2 of the Jesus Identity series. Join us next time for part 3, which addresses supernatural evidence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others. May we no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching. Let us become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ.